Hi, this is Lecture 2, Romanticism, in English 272, Survey of British Literature 2, Fall 2016. I am Dr. Renee Dupre, and I'm teaching for New Mexico State University. A brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. First, we'll talk a little bit about the socio-historical context. This is our introductory lecture on Romanticism, so I'd like to spend some time ensuring that everybody understands the tremendous chaos and promise of the time in which our writers wrote. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about Enlightenment thinking versus Romanticism and how the thinking and ideology transformed during that time. Third, we're going to look at some of the literary responses to those changes. We'll talk a little bit about the poetry of the age and the role that poetry played. We'll talk some about the emerging genres that we know and how they evolved during that time. And finally, the themes and motifs. Now, before you panic, I promise this really is a very short lecture, so I'll be covering a lot of material in a short time. This is a bird's eye overview, and you are expected to carefully read the material in your text. I've also provided some supplementary videos. I especially recommend watching all of them, really, but the BBC ones are tremendous, even if they are a little bit lengthy. Let's start with the socio-historical context. We have to remember, 1776, the United States declared independence from Great Britain. In 1783, the United States succeeded in gaining independence, which was a bit of an embarrassment for the British nobles of the time. Remember, Great Britain at that point was the largest imperialist country in the world. It had holdings globally, and the United States was a prize. So for the United States to secede was a really horrible thing if you happen to be a British nobleman at the time. But the real beginning of the Romantic era is always considered the French Revolution. And that was to the end from 1789 to 1815, when Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. The storming of the Bastille by an angry mob happened on July 14, 1789. It was unprecedented. Before then, people were not expected to think or to stand up for themselves. The revolution led to great, great hope for the dissolution of social and class barriers. There was this incredible release of individual energy where suddenly people felt that they could be an individual, they could succeed, they could move forward, perhaps have a different life than their parents had had. There was a strong belief in a rational and democratic society, even fraternal love. This was the core of the French Revolution. As the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, man is born free and is everywhere in chains, and that is what they were trying to break, was those chains. Instead, Rousseau and others felt that all men are by nature free and equal. These were huge ideals. To us today, they come as common sense, no? But at that time, this was a radical pattern of thinking. Radical enough that it turned into a bloody, bloody war. However, things didn't quite work out the way that people had planned. First of all, the Jacobins took over and decided that they were going to eliminate Christianity from France. And then there was the reign of Robespierre, sheer terror, with people being guillotined, people just being destroyed because of just the hungry for power. And finally, Napoleon, who turned out to be an absolute despot. He was defeated in 1815 at Waterloo, but not before. He had created tremendous damage, killed many, many people. Not surprisingly, the early sympathies of the major writers soon turned. It was a repressive regime, not only in France but in England, which was at war with France for much of this period. The other thing that was happening was more subtle and was more of a cultural change. We had changing economic models. This was a time when the word shopping was first coined. People didn't shop before then. And those changing economic models, largely due to the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, also changed demographics and geography. Before, the English countryside had been one large field. Now fences sprung up, dividing the large fields into smaller ones. Demographics shifted as people moved from the countryside to urban settings where they could make a living. The emergence of Romanticism really was also a response to the Enlightenment age of reason. During the Enlightenment, people thought that things could be solved, that things were going to stay the same, that everything was simply a big mechanical puzzle that could be solved. These people were in the middle of a shift from an agricultural to an industrialized society, in a land where people had always worked with hoes and worked the land. Suddenly there were large steam engines belting across the country, belching smoke into the air. Large factories, coal mines, and the labor was no longer outside, but it was inside in dingy textile mills and mines. Many of the Romantic writers felt absolute dismay at the depersonalization of machinery. Suddenly everything was no longer individual. We'd not quite reached the age of mass production, but machinery suddenly depersonalized what they did, especially the printing press for writers. On the other hand, there was widespread access to reading materials and an increased literacy rate and access to books, largely again because of the printing press. Thus, education, thought, words spread throughout the land, making the ground fertile for emerging thought. The Romantics in large part valued aesthetics, nature, feelings, imagination, and emotion, and that was their response to that age of reason, the mechanistic model that had come before. And in some ways, they were probably trying to hold on to some sort of control over a rapidly changing world, a world that was being transformed by all of these industrial forces. Here's a quick chart of some Enlightenment versus Romanticism ideals and ideas. The Enlightenment thinker saw reason as the core of human identity. To the Romanticist, it was imagination. Nature was something to be understood and conquered to the Enlightenment thinker, whereas nature was a place to find solace and foster creativity. The Enlightenment thinker saw the world as a static place. The Romantic saw it as dynamic and changing. Everything could be understood from an objective point of view if you were an Enlightenment thinker. To the Romanticist, everything was colored by one's own experiences and place. The mechanistic view of the universe that was seen by the Enlightenment thinker was contrasted with a universe that was organic, living, vital, changing. The Enlightenment thinker liked to maintain order. Those were the Midwesterners who mowed their lawns every day. The Romantic thinker valued disorder and spontaneity, something that was reflected in their love of the wildness of nature. The Enlightenment thinker thought that art should stay the same. It was an expression of common humanity and something that was going to stay the same. Where the Romanticist thought that art evolved and changed, and it had to be the expression of individual feelings and experience. These are tremendously different thoughts and paradigms, and as you can see, they not only reflected the world around them, but they actually started to create it. One of the big ways in which they began to create it, believe it or not, was poetry. During this age, poets were rock stars. Poetry was absolutely devoured by the newly reading public. People read poetry, they recited poetry, and anybody who was a poet was revered. Poetry was seen not as something archaic and inaccessible, but a spontaneous overflow, to use William Wordsworth's words, of feelings. It was above all an expression of the individual. And remember, the concept of the individual was a relatively new one. Poetic form was important. We have to remember that while those feelings were there, the structure of the poem served as a scaffolding for those feelings. The form of the poem gives us a way to express our feelings and put them into words that can be shared and resonate with others. Otherwise, it's just a mass of feelings. And so the poet sought to capture those feelings in the very formal structure of the poem. In that way, transforming feelings and emotions into art. Here's a quick overview of what was happening in some of the literary genres in the Romantic Age. Poetry, which I've spoken a little bit about. Remember, those poets were rock stars. They were the most popular mode. There are 6 big names that have been studied: Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Those are generally the big names that have come down through the literary canon. But others are beginning to receive attention today. For instance, Barbauld, who we read for this week, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, and many, many others are starting to emerge as we get a fuller picture of the incredible literary output of the period. There were some novels, and some were notable. And drama, not so much, kind of unremarkable. One notable and frequently unremarked development was actually in France, where Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote what is arguably the first autobiography. Again, let's think of autobiography as not really being possible unless one has a concept of oneself as an individual. Rousseau wrote his Confessions, which is often treated by autobiography scholars as the first ever autobiography. One form that really flourished during this time period was the essay. Many people were writing essays, a vindication of the rights of men and a vindication of the rights of women. It was Mary Wollstonecraft. We saw Thomas Carlyle. We saw that was Victorian. So many different people were writing essays. Some of the literary themes and motifs that were common. Importantly, writing was seen as symbolic, as opposed to the Romantic or the Enlightenment view of writing as something that was representational and realist. Writing symbolized, and we'll be speaking a little bit about that in our discussion of our mouse this week. Individualism was a key piece. Feelings, emotions. The poet wanted to feel at one with nature. There was this beauty of the pastoral, romantic English countryside. One thing that was common through all of the writings was the idea of melancholy, pensiveness, depression, and actually feeling that feeling. Now we treat it with Prozac. They went out and wrote about it. The purity of childhood. We'll look at that especially in Wordsworth's work, where the child is the father of the man. Love was important. Prior to this time, you grew up, you married, you had children. It was a very utilitarian thing that you did. You did not marry your soulmate. You did not seek the person of your dreams. The Romantics were the ones who started to change that definition of love, for better or for worse. There was also a big sense of mystery, the emergence of the Gothic, which we will study, and a fascination with the supernatural. All of these things you can see are pretty much in direct response to the perception of a world as immensely ordered and not in something that could be understood. They were looking at the things that can't be understood and arguing that this is something we cannot lose in our world. I want to point out another additional resource, the Enlightenment versus Romanticism chart by R.L.W. Clark is a wonderful overview of many of the contrasting themes. In addition, please do see the additional resources that are listed in the module. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me or post them to the discussion board on Canvas. Thanks very much.